want to thank you all for joining. The idea was this Pizzicato Players Ensemble was supposed to assemble quite easily in normal circumstances, but the idea is, well, how can we think forward? How can we review this with our assembled think tank and have critical conversations about planning and just where new things can grow into, and how a novel concept can be planned. A lot of this talks about where the performing arts in America is going, what it needs to do, and what new ensembles need to address immediately. I think more and more as new ensembles get launched, you need critical perspectives. So we have the short of it is we've got an idea that is typically not with plucked strings, which is the large ensemble, the benefits that go with that. So if you're an orchestral player, you have experience with all the benefits that go along with large orchestra. And for us, like guitarists, we go to the same conservatories, we get the same degrees, we certainly have the same rate of charge, but we get different things from that. And there's different environments, different working communities, and different professional circles that develop that economy around us. So everyone's working in different parts, and I think by having orchestral players, plucked strings, and all these different perspectives that we can move the ball around and discover, because what we learned with Tune Up Philly was that the benefits of large ensemble are real. It's sort of Field of Dreams, like if you build it, they will play, is sort of the idea. But we've seen students go on to use music to better their lives. And what I see in Philadelphia is there's degree programs at Temple and Curtis, but there aren't nearly the same pathways for those instruments in Philadelphia, but also in general throughout the States. So we may be piloting a very unique program here that doesn't exist on the college level. It doesn't exist on a national level. So I thought, well, getting some critical perspectives might help inform us. We have Bret here to sort of moderate these discussions. Bret has many podcasts under his belt, and I think Bret is definitely fine-tuned the art of the conversation. So with that, thank you all for joining. I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Welcome to the Pizzicato Players Zoom Symposium. I'm your host, Bret Williams. I'm also the host of Classical Guitar Insider. Today, we're joined by featured panelists Daniel Boring, classical guitar, Helen Gerhold, harp, Jennings Glenn, flautist, Javier Oviedo, saxophonist, Delia Robb Snyder, clarinetist, Aaron Valme, trombone, and Elizabeth Steiner, harp. They represent the Lyra Society, the Frederick Flute Choir, the Classical Sax Project, the Mastery Charter, and Nadia, the National Arts Diversity Integration Association. Thank you all for joining us. And the Pizzicato Players is a very interesting project and very near and dear to my heart. Not only is Paul an old and dear friend of mine, the idea of creating an orchestra of plucked instruments and the sort of opportunities that that's going to give us as classical guitarists, lute players, the oboe players, continuo players, all the variety, banjo players, the multitude of instruments that are going to have a home now because of this situation is something that is of immense importance. So we're going to start with our first focal point, and this is the benefits of a large ensemble upbringing. And a lot of our panelists today were Philadelphia Youth Orchestra graduates. I think we have a lot of people who can speak to these issues as we embark on this journey. Oftentimes, plucked string instruments receive less hours under a baton, less time as a part of a large ensemble, less networking opportunities, less visibility, while their college and conservatory costs are equal to those of orchestral performers. And we have a lot of panelists who can address this, but let's just take a look at Daniel Boring to begin with, who is our guitarist. He can probably share, my sentiment. When you get out of school, it kind of hurts knowing that you can't be in an orchestra or even a quartet sometimes. What do you think about that, Daniel?
Boy, doesn't that ring a bell? It couldn't be more true. And like you said, we have the luxury while we're in school to be surrounded by all these other musicians that we can kind of click our fingers and put together a quick ensemble if needed. And once we leave school, that luxury is far from the truth, usually. So for my particular experience in grad school, that's when I really, well, firstly, I've always loved to collaborate with other musicians, and I always say that's the curse and the blessing of the classical guitar is that you don't need anyone else to play it. It's a self-sufficient instrument, but as guitarists, we get very often shut off from the real musical world. So for me, that was not an option. I started playing continuo and heavily got into Baroque music in graduate school, and that's what really drew me to more of an orchestral setting. Even though I'm still a classical guitarist, I primarily make my living playing continuo and specializing in music of the Baroque period. But that's one of the, I think, great highlights of the guitar is that it can be integrated into many different types of music, and not only a guitar ensemble, but this way, historically, the plucked instrument has been an integral part of the orchestra, certainly not the modern orchestra. But the Baroque orchestra had a high contingency of plucked instruments, theorbos, Baroque guitars, different types of lutes, obviously harps. Um, and what really drew me to that, coming from kind of the rock school playing, which a lot of us guitarists come from, is the room for improvisation. Growing up in rock bands, a lot of it is improvisational, and that's what really drew me to the Baroque world and the way of playing continuo that's highly improvisational. And so that's one direction I think that's a great direction to take is utilizing plucked strings into an orchestral modern setting. Doesn't have to be Baroque music, but it's certainly a great way to start um, and kind of integrate it into other orchestral settings and bring in other orchestral instruments, not just guitar ensembles.
Right. Well, that's sort of speaking to the point. I'm going to actually go over to Javier Oviedo because he has experience with an instrument that is also not always utilized in orchestras. That would be the saxophone. And I actually went to Manus with Javier. It's good to see Javier and Delia, and of course Paul, all my buddies from school. I haven't seen you guys for a long time. It's good to see everybody still doing well. But you started the classical sax project, which I think Daniel was sort of talking about how, as guitarists, yes, there are these opportunities. Continuo could be one of them, where you are, but that, as we know, every town has at best you know one early music ensemble with continuo that's going to employ them on a regular basis, and there's only one continuo player in that ensemble. Javier has experience through classical sax project creating an ensemble where it has one instrument playing all the parts. Do you want to talk about sort of, were you driven to that through desperation?
Not knowing what to do.
Yeah.
Well, my experience certainly. I mean, I went to both state school and conservatory, and those are two very different experiences. The state school, generally, you have a band sort of world to deal with. Or wind ensemble, really, not band. I shouldn't say that. There is the marching band, there is that, but there's the idea of a wind ensemble, which is very much, and the music can be as sophisticated as some of the great orchestral pieces. And so I had the pleasure and honor of attending the University of Texas in Austin, which has a premier wind ensemble. And then I go to a conservatory setting where, let's face it, half the students didn't even know what instrument I was playing.
Yeah.
I actually got that question, what is that? My experience really, and I'm sure many people in the same situation as myself, we sort of have to sort of learn to sort of become our own mentors and our own motivators. Yes, you can. There is an opportunity to play in the orchestra every once in a while, and certainly there are the big pieces that everybody knows that most of the, let's say, second and third tier orchestras will do in a regular season. But most of the rep beyond that is very, very complex repertoire, and you're only going to see some of the largest ensembles with a big budget even come near programming that. And a lot of times, a lot of these orchestras, even the larger budgeted orchestras, won't have a saxophonist on the roster. This is all, a lot of it is word of mouth, or, this is somebody who they know. Many times, and I've experienced that with some ensembles, they'll have, the third clarinetist happens to play
Right.
saxophone.
An auxiliary instrument it becomes.
Right, and
yeah.
which is fine, but if this is most of that repertoire is soloistic repertoire. This is not, you're playing a whole note. This is a solo. So
Right.
it does kind of behoove you to get somebody who actually does this instrument for real, not just can play it.
Right.
Right. And so what I decided, and early on, especially after coming from a situation where I did have a lot of quartet experience and I had a lot of ensemble experience. We were even in a saxophone ensemble that recorded and were, up for Grammy nomination. I mean, for consideration. So I could make my own curriculum. Certainly when I went to Manus, I was sort of on my own in a way. So I chose to explore chamber music with other instruments, and I have done the saxophone stuff, so I'd like to see what it's like to play with a string quartet, or a singer, or a guitarist. I've played with guitar since then.
Yeah, that is quite the journey. We're going to go on to the second point, focal point, the economy of large ensembles. Coaches, ringers, arrangers, composers, conductors, stagehands, volunteers, foundations, and even auditioning are all facets of large ensemble orchestra that expand opportunity for engaging working professionals through a performing arts economy. Glenn is our sort of resident flautist on this panel. You are the director and I think the founder of the Frederick Flute Choir. Is that correct, Mr. Glenn?
I'm very excited by what you all are doing, what Paul is doing, what you're doing, because there needs to be outlets for the plucked instruments that you're referring to. And as we all know, so sadly, there are not. Even though I'm a flutist and we play in orchestras and bands and jazz bands and whatever, there's a lot of flute players out there. And a lot of them don't play once they leave high school or once they leave college. I really stumbled into this ensemble, this ensemble world almost by accident. I've been a college band director and flute instructor for a number of years out in the West. And we moved back here. I worked on my doctorate, but I also grew up in the DC area. And at that point in the late 80s, my parents were very ill. And basically I gave up my college position to move back here and help them. But I needed to have a job. And as probably most of you know, college band directors, somebody's got to die before you can even apply. And by then the position is already filled by 4 people that graduated from Michigan or something, So I did take a job in a public school. In my college position, playing the flute was required of me. Publish or perish. If you're a writer, if you're a musician, you gave recitals. And I loved that. And I did it and I had time to do it. Public schools, I didn't have time for that. And I decided, well, I've got to do something about that. When I went to the school district in Frederick, Maryland, I put a memo out to all of the music teachers. There were about 90. Said, if you want to play flute, I've got some quartet music, come on. So 5 people showed up plus me. But over the years, those instruments, and I think this could be the same thing with the Pizzicato Players, the people that wanted to participate just were coming out of the woodwork. They wanted to play. I played this then. I played that then. I taught class. I played classical guitar in high school, and then I never touched it again. And basically, the bottom line is what I've been lucky enough over the last 31 years is to take that little trio and quartet that we had, and we've now done over 300 performances at the Kennedy Center. Not at the Kennedy Center. We played at the Kennedy Center, White House grounds. But our real mission is to play here in the Frederick, Maryland area for retirement homes, churches, you name it. And over those years, because this is another aspect of music, what are you going to do? How are you going to get it? Who's going to arrange it? Who's going to compose it? When I started flute choirs, there was nothing out there. But over the years, we began to see arrangements of good music, maybe some Mozart, maybe some Beethoven, maybe even some Bach. And they started to grow and it started to become a thing. And then we got serious composers that would compose work for flute choir. And again, to quickly speed ahead, the National Flute Association, which is an enormous international organization, in the 1970s, when I was in grad school studying, if your intention was not to play in a symphony orchestra, you were wasting your time. Flute choirs were what existed, were not even laughed at. They were so, but in those years, right now, the engine that's driving the National Flute Association are flute choirs.
Well, that definitely speaks to sort of the success that we might be able to expect with the Pizzicato Players. Still focusing on the economy of large ensembles, sort of addressing the rising cost. Aaron Valme, trombonist, and I believe the director of Nadia, is also part of the Bravo Brass Ensemble. Just looking at the rising cost of sort of these ensembles, the coaches, the ringers, the arrangers, the composers, all of these things. With your experience with Bravo Brass, did you experience any sort of things that became prohibitive cost-wise when you were
Sure.
forming that?
So a clarifying point. I'm not the founder of Bravo Brass. I was a
Okay.
participant for several years. The founder is Maestro Paul Bryan, who's the dean of the Curtis Institute of Music as well, and a long-time mentor of mine. I could speak from experience on behalf of like the Juilliard Trombone Choir about the prohibitive costs of having, you know, a single instrument or like family ensemble. You know, arrangements and commissions cost money, and doing high-level recordings cost money as well. The Juilliard Choir in March, actually 7 days before everything got shut down due to COVID-19, completed a recording of a holiday album, and it was such a huge expense. You know, we have to get a space that works well for the instrument. You have to curate the space. You have to be willing to travel to and from, you know, some middle of nowhere school in northern New Jersey that happens to have a great hall. And then you have to pay the engineer and the engineer's assistants. You have to pay for, you know, the CDs themselves and all of these things. And other than finding spaces to rehearse, and especially now post-COVID, and getting creative about engaging students, which has been a real challenge. I'm still enrolled at the Juilliard School in my senior year, and one of the biggest hurdles has been designing the way people get in and out of spaces, believe it or not, you know, like being safe down to that minutia, you know, what doors we come in, how far we sit apart, your foot has to be on this X, and don't move your chair or we're going to take points off of your grade, that whole thing. So on top of all the other issues we're facing, I think that some of the leading costs would be, you know, getting things like commissions and arrangements done at a high level. Some, I think, ensembles have moved along at different paces. For example, brass choirs and brass ensembles have a longer history thanks to groups like the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, which has this long, rich and extended international history of soloing and traveling the world and recording. So we have this beautiful repertoire that was developed by groups like that. So I think the issues that a instrument-specific group faces, whether it's strings, winds, or brass, or percussion for that matter, are different than the issues that an orchestra is facing, not because the concept is that far different, but because there are gaps in investment that we have to make up for continually, and we have to understand that these sorts of things are going to take time going forward. It's really exciting to see that there's a substantial investment being made, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation because it's great to be able to cover a corner of any instrument family and helping students get those resources and experiences, you know, and I think it all comes down to investing the time and investing the resource, and bringing people to the idea is, I think, a lot of the work as well.
That's awesome. Hey, I have a follow-up, Aaron, to those points of view. Here's some of the perspective that I brought, and I'd love to open this up if you want to have a brief, less formal moment. But in terms of, we're talking about repertoire, and one of the challenges with a novel ensemble is you've got to deal with precedents, and you've got to deal with sort of the Western canon, which I think for this particular ensemble is easily done through either Renaissance folia or Baroque music. That's there. Doing arranging, no problem. But we're also informing ourselves with tune-up Philly. So when we choose the repertoire for tune-up Philly, so we make sure to represent nations that are around the world. Folk music is very important. Folk music has driven Earth and our disciplines for so many thousands of years. So I'm a big proponent of folk music. I'm a big proponent of entertaining music, relevant cultural music, in addition to the Western canon. And with Tune Up specifically, we've made sure to have representation, so that as the children in Tune Up Philly, when they go into large ensemble, their vision says there's relevance. I'm seeing reflections of my neighborhood, and we're playing music of people that represent our communities. It's not a complete division, and we're also using that to engage with the Western canon. So I think that there's an opportunity with the repertoire, is to hit all those cylinders, because to me, the repertoire represents, the human condition and the human collateral. So who we pick is extremely important. So when our tune-up kids played, Smokey Robinson and Benny King, and then they played the Peer Gynt Suite, that's a better narrative for me on a lot of different reasons. It checks a lot of different boxes. And I think that as ensembles and institutes move forward, there's more of a responsibility on that component. So I just wanted to, I know Nadia works with that directly, so I would just maybe get Aaron's 2 cents on that.
Of course. I think that points at a larger question that has been kind of thrown into our laps as artists and as leaders, after dealing with COVID-19 and after dealing with the heightened racial tensions. And the question that I think is at the center of the problem that you've just expressed is, what are you really in the business of as an organization, as an arts organization? What do you do? Who do you serve, and why? Now, we can all say, oh, we love music and we love bringing people together and blah, 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 blah. But wait, now COVID has made that more difficult. So what do you mean when you say bringing people together? What do you mean by people? What kind of people? And from where? How? How are you reaching out to them? Are you reaching out to them? If not, why? These are the kinds of questions that keep us up at Nadia. When I think what you said was really beautiful about, integrating relevance into programming at Tune Up Philly. And I think that that's a theme that, or a motive rather, that other large organizations should be singing more often. At Nadia, we're really looking at anti-discriminatory behaviors for organizations. So we're not actually looking at how do we diversify. We're looking at how do we be anti-discriminatory, because that's a very important way to look at these things. How do we actually look at, analyze, and shut down institutional behaviors that perpetuate the exclusion of certain groups of people? And how do we find them? How do we work around them and work on them? And how do we ask better questions about them, which is another big goal of Nadia as well, is how do we improve the conversation surrounding equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging? And I think that Pizzicato Players is a great example of the latter of those 4 terms, which is belonging. How do you make a group of instruments belong in a group? And it's such a beautiful thing, because this is how you go out on a limb and you bring them together and you step up to the challenge.
Aaron, you bring up a really good point as far as the repertoire is concerned, and that's sort of the essence of making this a more welcoming environment. So we have Elizabeth Steiner and Helen Gerold, and they have a lot of experience with Lyra, which is a harp organization, and they kind of get a lot of people from environments that might not have access, underserved communities and such, into the room with classical music and into the room with harp. We have, I think, Helen, you were a Philadelphia Youth Orchestra alumni, and now you are heading up that program.
So I did PYAO for a year, and then I did PYO for 5 years. Elizabeth Steiner, was actually executive director before me. So we both obviously have similar experiences in that, and she really helped actually mentor me into my new position as well. The Lyra Society brings free harps, harp lessons, presentations, mentorship, and college and financial aid counseling to students in Philadelphia. And we currently have 30 students all across the city in 5 schools, ages ranging from 7 years old to 18. And so we really not only try to cultivate, their musical talent and their harp talent, but also help them grow into great young people that'll hopefully go into higher education and pursue whatever their interests may be, and not necessarily harp every time. The way we kind of run things is we have presentations at every school, and we have an hour-long presentation, usually during like one of their assembly times or something like that. And we just kind of present the harp and say, hey, this is a really cool instrument. Here's some history about it. Here are some pop tunes all the kids really enjoy when we do some Drake or, some other pop music on it. And then those kids can then sign up for an audition. And then we have like a 5-minute mini lesson where we basically can get a feel for how these kids take instruction and take to the harp. And based on that, we then pick those students to then take lessons. Lizzie, did you want to add anything about how we engage our students?
Sure. Thanks, Helen. And I'm so happy to be on this call with all of you today and Helen. We work so closely together, and it was just great I have to say the harp community in Philadelphia is wonderful, and we're really supportive of each other, and we really lift each other up and literally move each other's harps. So I think the harp is an instrument that is so interesting and unique, of course, because it's rare, not quite as rare as some of the other instruments mentioned on the call already, but the harpist can be very isolating, and a lot of harpists will only go into conservatory, often having played in harp ensemble, or might not even have played in ensemble before they are accepted to a high-level institution. Me personally, I was super lucky to start the harp in my public school in Seattle, Washington, where I'm from, and they threw me in the orchestra from day one. And I was sight reading piano conductor scores in 6th grade and sitting in the back of the second violins and getting yelled at and making friends. And that was what I loved. I think it was playing the harp in the practice room by myself was so wonderful. And then I could roll it out into the orchestra and be part of a group. And that completely was the path from then on. And then when I met Elizabeth Hainan, who founded Lyra, and moved to Philadelphia to start working for Lyra and to study with her to get my master's, it was kind of like experiencing that school opportunity again, but on the other side as an adult, and providing that access that we talked so much about at Lyra to an instrument that's ungainly, it's strange, it's rare, and it's expensive. And so we have all these harps that we maintain, and we put them into schools, and it's just incredible to see how children can respond to the instrument, and then once they are in ensemble, it's then taken again to the next level. So I'm super honored to teach a harp ensemble class at Girls High, Philadelphia High School for Girls, which had 3 principal harpists of major American orchestras graduate from this school. It's such an incredible story we like to tell. But the ensemble is where a student who's very talented can then completely, I think, blossom.
That sort of brings us to our next focal point, pathways. And I would like to engage you and Delia on this. Delia is she's our resident teacher, and then we would like to get her perspective on this. But pathways, Philadelphia now has guitar degrees at Temple and Curtis, and let's explore the landscape on how a Philly kid can follow those aspirations, or is it only an outsider's option? And Delia, what's your experience with the kids and their relationship with musical instruction and their musical future based on what they're exposed to at this point in their lives?
Well, I mean, I think the great thing about Philadelphia is there are tons of opportunities for music making, but I think there's sort of some like question around not even whether it's accessible. I think it's more around whether it's invigorating and who it's interesting to. And I am a Philly kid, went through public school in Philadelphia. I mean, a kid, I'm almost 40. Sorry, not to shock Javier over here, who I've known since I was 18. But also, and I have a 5.5-year-old who's, Suzuki book, almost done Suzuki book 1 on the violin. And I teach at a large elementary school in South Philly, and I've been doing that. I've been at that school for 7 years actually. And so I think like there, we have Settlement Music School that I attended as a kid from kindergarten up through 12th grade and had scholarships, and we've got the youth orchestra, and we have we have other youth orchestras. We have regional youth orchestras. I was big, my big like motivator was All City, which I loved. I was in the All City Orchestra and band for years. I loved it. You got to miss a day of school. You got to meet kids from around the city. You got to hang out at Girls High in those like marble pink hallways. It was amazing. So I think like there are opportunities, but I think it's like a lot of it becomes very exclusive. I think it has to do with like who in Philadelphia is getting engaged. And if we look, I think, and I don't think this is a secret to the youth orchestra, but if we look at how many members of the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra come from Philadelphia, it's a very small number. They're mostly coming from suburban schools where students are getting private high-level lessons and are also getting basically private lessons during the school day. And so I think that there's some prohibitiveness there, but I think also in what Paul and both Aaron were speaking to in terms of how we value both folk music, pop music, jazz, hip hop, like I could go down the genres that I think interest kids across the board. And that's not to say that a kid who grows up in Philadelphia doesn't want to become a classical oboe player, right? Like I'm not taking away from what anyone desires, but I do think that when classical music has really put itself on the shelf. And I think that that's a big problem. And, for me, a lot of what I think about with my students is like cultivating lifelong music makers and lovers, and not necessarily talking so much about cultivating the conservatory level musician who's going to want to go and practice French horn in a practice room for 8 hours a day. Because, I did that, and I went to Manus with you guys, and I went to USC and got into that, competitive clarinet studio and was practicing and taking orchestra auditions. And I like hit a wall, and I was like, this is not for me. This is not my audience. This is not the kind of music I want to be playing. This is not the kind of musical experience I want to have. And it's hard for me as a music teacher to want to even encourage some of my students to become classical musicians because there's so little opportunity. And when we're talking about kids who might have limited resources, I don't want to encourage them to go spend those resources on something that might not take them to a career where they can make any money. There's so much music to be made, and there's so many kids so capable and so desiring of making music and having great musical experiences, but we don't have to put it on a shelf. And why do we create these opportunities for kids where it's like, you have to pass this audition and that audition, and you have to be this good? So I think something like the Pizzicato Players is kind of like an amazing idea, because it could be something where everyone has an opportunity to use that love of music with maybe not necessarily being like the Segovia of the ensemble.
We're kind of almost at the end of this, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through our focal point with each of you individually, and just, with relative brevity, can you just discuss what you see as far as future visioning is concerned with the Pizzicato Players? Where can this go? What can it do? How many can benefit? Can it help shape the profile of these instruments to be equitable? Let's go to Aaron. What do you see as far as the future of the Pizzicato Players is concerned?
I think that it's an excellent, almost textbook definition, if I may, Paul, of an anti-discriminatory practice ensemble, right? You go out of your way to make a space for a group that has been traditionally underrepresented, period. Whether it's along the lines of instrument, race, sexual orientation, gender, et cetera, et cetera. You take the steps, and what we hope is that some of those processes will remain the same as we go on to tackle some of those larger social issues in our more established institutions, right?
Elizabeth, what do you think as far as the future is concerned for the Pizzicato Players?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity to create a container for synthesis among all of the musical talent we have in Philadelphia, which is, I mean, the incredible rich tradition of the classical tradition in Philadelphia is unparalleled. And that's why, you know, I moved here to study, and that's many came to Temple and to Curtis to be a part of that and to study with those teachers, and to get that kind of almost old school, old world feeling of studying your instrument, and just that feeling doesn't even exist for me on the West Coast, right? Like I knew I would have to come to the East Coast and to Philadelphia specifically to
That's so
experience
interesting.
that.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also the rich, just incredibly talented community of musicians that might not even read music and are possibly coming up through the church, and then are playing a few gigs around Center City, and then they get one call and they're on tour with Beyonce. And that is a whole other group of musicians I've kind of become acquainted with that are just as talented and hardworking and entrepreneurial, and then they can go off and skyrocket. And my students at Lyra are equally inspired by both. So I think the more opportunities we have, the better.
Daniel, where do you see this going for our instrument? And I understand, from what I understand, you play a lot of these instruments.
I do. I play several, but what I think is great, and to kind of echo what Aaron was saying, is that the possibility of integrating instruments and instrumentalists that kind of might have left out in terms of being kind of these misfit instruments that don't really belong in one orchestra or one wind band or wherever. And bringing these people together and making music together, and also to echo what Delia was saying, is that it's okay if you don't go on to become a professional musician. Just having these experiences, life experiences, as we all know, playing music brings. It's not just musical experiences, which are obviously great, but having, you know, these connections and lifelong friends that we've all made through making music. And doesn't really matter if these friends aren't professional musicians, but it's all about the experience and bringing everyone together, and that's the beauty of making music, obviously.
Helen, what do you think, not just about this ensemble, but for the future of all of your respective organizations? You know, what are we looking towards the future for these children?
Well, I think we kind of all touched on it, is inclusivity and giving the opportunity for every kid to have the same, at least for me, and I'm sure for all of you too, just having the experiences that were so life-changing that a lot of these kids would never get to have unless we were in existence and doing what we're doing now. And I think now that, you know, we've been through COVID and all of that stuff, besides, you know, the music education, just making connections with people. I mean, we're all kind of starved for human connection at this point a little bit. And I think Pizzicato Players will be coming at a really great time where once, you know, we safely start opening things up again, that these kids can start making connections, not just within, for example, for Lyra, not just within their own harp class, but within other instruments, and opening their eyes to new worlds.
Paul, what is your vision of the future?
Well, while I have everyone here, I just want to thank you for your time and attention. This is very rewarding, and I feel the love. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for chatting. For me, I mean, look at Jennings, you know, we need conduits that allow for an ensemble and the performers to age over time. There should be more music making, and everyone starts music, but they get edged out. They get edged out for some reason because it's too hard, or you're not fulfilling a prophecy about a vision. And the whole concept and the entire sound world and the characters, everyone's character is different. If you're a guitarist, you're a guitarist.
Yeah.
So by supporting the instrument, you're supporting the variety of characters, and you're allowing for people to have a relationship with that ensemble for their whole life. Instead of saying, here's something in a box and now you're done with it. You can no longer make group music like that. And so I think you can check all the boxes, and hopefully this spurs up more national, you know, once we get rolling, maybe 10 years, not 500, but maybe 10 years down the road, other groups can say, we got a bunch of guitarists and ukuleles and harps. Why aren't we doing this? That would be great.
I'd like to personally thank everybody on the panel as well. All of you have made contributions to our craft and the genre of classical music in a variety of ways. And everybody is not just sitting around practicing alone, as we keep on talking about. All of you are trying to make a difference in the world, and all of you are doing it on so many different levels. So thank you all for joining us. And if anybody who's watching would like to, they can visit pyomusic.org for more information and information on how to get involved. Thank you all very much for coming.